Hello, everybody, and welcome back to I Am Nami, Kansas, a mental health podcast by Kansans for Kansans. I'm your host, Isaac, and this week we're talking about rural and frontier counties and the unique obstacles they face when it comes to accessing mental health care. But first, let's define what rural and frontier counties even are. The 2015 annual report put out by the Rural and Frontier Subcommittee of the Governor's Behavioral Health Services Planning Council here in Kansas assigned one of 5 labels to all 105 counties based on population density. 16 counties in Kansas met the classification for either urban or semi-urban. The remaining 89 counties were either densely settled rural, or frontier. In 2020, the most urban county, Johnson County, had 780 times the number of people per square mile than the most frontier county, Greeley County. Access to mental health care in these rural and frontier counties falls considerably behind urban and semi-urban counties. For example, using information from the Kansas Health Institute, Kansas Department of Aging Disability Services, and HealthSource, I was able to find 33 crisis facilities that provide short-term care for adults experiencing a psychiatric crisis unrelated to substance use, in addition to 33 long-term care facilities for adults with serious mental health conditions. Only 10 of the 33 crisis facilities are located in densely settled rural, and frontier counties, in addition to only 5 of the 33 long-term care facilities. Additionally, many of these facilities are limited to specific age groups, such as those 65 or older, and many only serve the county they're located within. Furthermore, according to data collected by County Health Rankings in 2022, there were alarming disparities when it came to the number of mental health care providers per county. In urban counties, there were around 26.7 mental health care providers per 10,000 people. For semi-urban, this number was 25.7 providers, so about the same. Densely settled rural counties saw a sharp decline with only 14.5 providers per 10,000 people, while rural counties had 9.7. When it came to frontier counties, there were only 3.2 providers per 10,000 people. If that's hard for you to get your head around, don't worry, those are pretty abstract numbers. So think of it this way. If 20% of the population is struggling with a mental health condition, and every single one of those people sought out healthcare, that would mean that the average mental health care provider in one of the 6 urban counties would have a caseload of about 75 people in order to serve everyone. In frontier counties, mental health care providers would have a caseload of around 625 clients. Similarly, providers in rural counties would have a caseload of 207 clients, and providers in densely settled rural counties would have a caseload of 138. So although the population in these counties is significantly less than the population in the urban counties, the need for mental health care providers is around 8 times higher in frontier counties, 3 times higher in rural counties, and 2 times higher in densely settled rural counties. The effects of this lack of access can be unfortunately seen in other data, such as suicide statistics. Data from Greenberg on suicide rates from 2016 to 2020 revealed that the suicide rate in frontier counties was 24% higher than the state average and 9% higher in rural counties. Today, we'll be talking with some of our fellow Kansans from these rural and frontier areas, as well as those who work in agriculture, since those two groups are so heavily intertwined. We'll start off our conversation with Itzel, who was raised in Dodge City and continues working with Western Kansans as a social worker. Then we'll talk with Lowell, a 4th-generation farmer and agricultural advocate. So let's start off with Itzel. Welcome, Itzel.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad you can come on. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So as Isaac mentioned, I'm Itzel Moya. I was born and raised in Dodge City, Kansas. And if you don't know where Dodge City is, well, we are in the southwest portion of the state. And we are not exactly completely rural, but we are a smaller community. And let's see. So my journey started with mental health probably At a very young age, I was about 11 when my mom started experiencing mental health problems, and that is when I started learning more about the subject. And then when I was in high school, some of my peers were going through a lot of mental health issues, and it made the news that Dodge City had a significant amount of suicides in our youth and young adult population, and that was really alarming for our community. And at this point, like senior year, you get that question of what are you doing with your life? What career would you like to take? And at that point, I really thought of what my community needed. And I was like, well, we need more mental health resources. So I'm going to venture out into the mental health realm. And so I did. I decided to major in social work. I um, attended Dodge City Community College, graduated with my associates, then transferred over to Fort Hays State University, where I graduated with my bachelor's in social work and then my master's in social work from Fort Hays. And then I moved back to Dodge City, and I was like, okay, it's my time to finally do something for my community. And that's when I spoke with Nami, Kansas, and I was able to find employment with them, and I've been working on ever since October of 2021 with Nami, Kansas, and trying to help out with the southwest area of the state and bringing more resources to this area.
Yeah, what specifically do you do with Nami out there?
So, in my position with Nami, what I like to do in this area is just try to spread awareness. One story I like telling is one time when I was living in Hayes, I came across Nami, and I'm like, well, what is Nami? What do they do? And I feel like a lot of us, that's our question when you first hear about, you see the letters Nami, and we're like, okay, what is this? What does it stand for? And I got into that conversation of what Nami is, and I'm like, okay, perfect. What do you do for Western Kansas? And they're like, oh, well, we're in Hayes. So I was like, okay, cool. Hayes isn't really out into the most western region of the state. Exactly. And then I started the conversation of like, okay, well, what can you help us do in that area? And eventually, throughout the course of time, I was able to get more involved. And then we started Nami Southwest Kansas affiliate in this area. And our primary goal is to start up support groups and educational groups, as well as volunteering in our community and spreading more mental health awareness. In general, I feel like Western Kansas and Southwest Kansas, we lack sometimes the knowledge of mental health topics, and the stigma is still really prevalent in these areas.
Yeah, so you have the unique position of being someone with a lived experience of, like dealing with mental health. You mentioned your mom earlier, but you're also now a social worker who can go out and actually give mental health care to others. That's what social workers are allowed to do. So with that unique perspective, how is access to care out in these areas, and how important is that mental health education piece in your opinion?
I it's so we do have mental health care in this area, but it's not as as you mentioned earlier, it's difficult to find a provider because there's one person for hundreds of people realistically. And so here in this part, at least in the southwest corner of the state, we have Compass Behavioral Health, and they have a big catchment area, and they have an amazing staff, and they provide a lot of services down from therapy to case management to mental health aid, anything really. Um, but the trouble comes into some of these. They have offices in Dodge City, Garden City, and in a few other towns. But then you get into some of the more rural towns where you'll have to be driving an hour, 45 minutes, an hour, maybe an hour and a half to get to an appointment. And that gets difficult, because a lot of people, that's just not feasible if you're working a full-time job. Or in this area, primarily, we have a lot of individuals in the farming community or agricultural jobs, such as feed yards and dairy farms and such. They don't have time to seek therapy. They don't have time to go drive themselves to an office. But thankfully, as we've all seen post-pandemic, we've had an increase in virtual services when it comes to virtual therapy, virtual case management, and such. And I know that's helped the community, but then you run into the struggle of internet. And
Yeah.
internet is terrible in this area. Not everywhere, but a lot of the times in these rural and frontier areas, you get a really strong wind, or it's raining, or it's snowing too much, your Wi-Fi is gone. And so yes, now we have the luxury, I guess, of seeking virtual services, but um, then it's difficult to sometimes find good Wi-Fi. So it's an interesting dynamic in our rural and frontier areas.
For sure. And then that stigma piece too that you had mentioned earlier, that's also a barrier to access, right? Because
Yeah.
if you think, oh, there's nothing wrong, or I don't want to be seen getting mental health care, it's gonna put an even bigger deterrent for you accessing that.
Definitely. I see that a lot in this area. So what we notice a lot in our smaller communities is the concept of, well, don't talk about it. If you don't talk about it, it's not going to happen. So if you have someone, for example, with a significant mental illness, for example, schizophrenia, a lot of the families are very quiet about it. If we're not talking about it, it's not happening. And sometimes
Right.
that does delay them from seeking mental health care. And then on top of that, when they do seek mental health care, well, you'll often find in smaller communities are like, oh, well, that family's crazy, or don't go around that family because they have X, Y, and Z going on. Um,
Mhm.
and I know that's not the case in every one of our smaller communities. Some of our smaller communities really rally together anytime something happens. But you do see that upside of stigma and the
Mhm.
prevalence in the smaller areas.
Right. And also Kansas, Western Kansas in particular, it's a very interesting landscape right now, just in terms of um, populations changing and growing and ebbing and flowing. We had previously talked about this, but how does that uh, impact basically the relationship with mental health care out there? We have all of these immigrant populations appearing.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And I think growing up in this area, it was normal to me to see that high population of Hispanics, high population of depending on your area, you might have more Asian families or Somalian families, and of course, a really high number of Hispanic families. And for me, it was normal. I never thought anything of it until I learned that that's not the case in every community. You don't see a high number of people speaking a different language and not English not being their primary language. And that does become a little bit harder when it comes to accessing care, because you have to, when a family, the number one thing you face with immigrant families is that there's that stigma that primarily is within their beliefs. And you see that a lot in the Hispanic culture, is that, you don't want to air out your dirty laundry. So just don't talk about it if you're going through something. And when you get past that stigma, which we are seeing a lot more in our families now, then you have to find care that's in your native language. So if that's trying to find a therapist that speaks Spanish, well, if you find one, that is awesome. But most of the time, they're booked out because, well, they might be the only Spanish speaking therapist, or depending on what language you're looking for. And sometimes what we face also is there are language lines or there are translators, but that rapport is difficult to build when you're working with someone that doesn't speak your native language. And we see that a lot in these communities. It's just difficult to build rapport and difficult to find services, or just really try to envelop into those families, immigrant families that are struggling, just because you don't have that understanding of their language, of their culture. And that's truly one thing. Cultural competence is very important, especially when you're working with mental health related issues. And it's a learning process for anyone really in our Western Kansas communities, where we have a high population of everything. We're a mixing bowl of cultures in this area.
Yeah, just in general, because there's just so few people out there doing mental health stuff. Like, we have, this things like language barriers to worry about, but at the same time, as we'll talk about this later with Lowell, but there's barriers with talking to ag workers about their jobs, and there's barriers if you're from a more urban area moving out to like rural Kansas. There's a whole different lifestyle, a whole different perspective out there that sometimes goes unaddressed or missing. I know social work particularly likes to emphasize cultural competency, which I'm a fan of too. But there's also, I think sometimes people are reductive about that, and there's just so many things in life, like again, being a farmer in Northwest
Yeah.
Kansas has a specific kind of culture around it that I don't understand because I'm not a farmer in Northwest Kansas. But also being
Yeah.
a Somali immigrant family living in Garden City, it's also a very unique sort of cultural background that I don't understand totally.
It's completely interesting, and you break down to, as you mentioned in social work, cultural competence is something that's super important, and that is something I wish was taught in more career fields. In any sort of helping field, even when you're getting down to maybe like a business degree, cultural competence is very important. And as you mentioned, in this area, you just don't know really what someone's going through, specifically with mental health, or as you mentioned, when it comes to the ag community, you don't know what like a Northwest farmer, what they go through compared to a Southwest farmer. They have, yes, they're both farmers, but they have different struggles that they go through, and it's one of those like learn and adapt type of situations.
Right. And then obviously we're talking a lot about Western Kansas since you're from Western Kansas, but then there are plenty of rural counties over here in Eastern Kansas. Um, for example, up north there are counties that feature, the reservations. We have 4 reservations here in Kansas. And so a lot of our indigenous population here in Kansas are in these rural and frontier counties, and that also brings with it a unique set of circumstances and obstacles and challenges to accessing mental health care.
I agree, and I think it's very easy to get stuck on like the bubble of the area you're from. I'm born and raised in Dodge City, so my bubble is right here, and that's all that exists in my world. But as you mentioned, there's communities that are struggling in Eastern Kansas, and as you mentioned, with the indigenous population up northeast, and it's interesting because depending on the area you're from, you might have knowledge of that or you might not. So if you're working in mental health, it's important to know the population in your region, really getting to know the different cultures, the different customs, the different lines of work also that you have there.
Because at the end of the day, like mental health doesn't really only impact one specific group of people; it impacts everybody, albeit in
Yeah.
unique ways, but it impacts everybody.
It's oftentimes what you hear with our different NAMI programs is, mental health is not a casserole illness, and and with that it comes in. It's not the type of illness that you take a casserole to when someone's sick, like you do when someone had surgery. You take a casserole to. You don't do that with mental illness, but that also that mix of everything. It's just something that you don't know. Mental illness affects everyone differently, and it's not something that we could tie into, oh, it's just in Western Kansas, just in Eastern, just to the Hispanic population. It's out there. And mental health affects all of us.
Yeah, I appreciate this conversation in that I feel like we're talking about rural and frontier counties. People sort of pigeonhole, regardless of the state, people pigeonhole what that looks like, what that means, when really it's, they're very interesting counties with unique challenges that they experience, but also unique strengths. There's unique population, population divisions in these division. They're unique populations in these counties. I know, like, I'm not from a rural area, but I am from a small town in eastern Kansas. So I feel like a solidarity with the rural and frontier counties, especially since my grandpa owned horses and I rode horses and I was more in these rural areas pretty frequently as a kid. There's just a lot that I think people overlook and diminish because they're not as built up and urbanized as, Kansas City is, for instance. But there's still a lot there, a lot of really interesting and great people, a lot of people who deserve to have healthcare. So I'm glad we're having this conversation today. And I'm glad you're out there too, do you, like that you got your degree and you went back to help people
Yeah,
in Dodge City area.
yeah, no, thank you. I feel like that, as you mentioned, it's not, this isn't a problem that pertains just specifically to Kansas. In any state, really, any region, you'll see those areas that are more rural and more frontier, and I'm sure they go through very similar struggles when it comes to accessing mental health care and healthcare in general. So it is a very interesting perspective to, especially when you grow up in the region, a more like rural and frontier region, and then you get to experience those bigger areas, and you're like, whoa, you have everything here. And it's a crazy concept, but still in our more urban areas, you still have that higher density of population, and you're still not seeing as many providers as well. So it's mental health is a statewide issue, not diminishing the fact that only rural Kansas goes through mental health problems. Of course, urban areas do too. But I'm glad that we're able to talk more in depth today about those rural and frontier areas, because sometimes we don't have enough advocates out there that are able to discuss, hey, this is what's going on and this is what I'm doing to help out.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was saying those numbers earlier, I got that data, and yeah, there are way more mental health care providers in urban areas. But my thought at the end of it was still, this is still not a great thing. Like even in urban areas, if every single person who needed mental health care sought it out, you're still looking at a caseload of 75 people. That's a lot of people to manage. So,
Yes.
so it's a problem nonetheless, and it's hopefully one that can unite people rather than increase divisions or prioritize this over the other. Like I just, it's an issue that affects all of us, and that's what this podcast is about, right? We are all
Yeah.
Nami, Kansas.
Yes. And it's that's the first step, is starting up that conversation. I often like saying, if you see something and you want it to change and it's not changing, what can you do to be part of that change? For me, for example, it was going to college and getting that social work degree and then coming back to my area because I knew I wanted to see change. And if that change for me is bringing more mental health resources and specifically more culturally competent resources to this area, then that's what I will do. That's my life journey right there.
Yeah, and that's actually a great segue into our next conversation with Lowell. So, Itzel, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and let's go talk with Lowell now. Hey, Lowell, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm a farmer in Lawrence, just out in Douglas County. Fourth generation with my wife's family. I grew up in Northwest Kansas on a farm and met my wife out in Colby, and she convinced me I should farm in Eastern Kansas instead of Western Kansas. So, long story short, uh, fourth generation on corn and soybeans and a small feedlot operation.
Lo, if you're comfortable, would you share your personal experience with mental health?
Yeah, for sure. It was 2017 or so, and I lost my father. To give you a little bit of background on that situation, my mom and dad went through a pretty bad divorce when I was about 11 or 12, and I ended up staying with my dad because he stayed in our hometown where I grew up and all my family was. So felt pretty safe, and that's all my friends were there, and that's where I wanted to stay. Um, got a little bit older, got ready to go to college, and things kind of tense between me and my father, like most young men and their dads. And it, I, I met Crystal there in my second year, had a small junior college out in Western Kansas, and really kind of put kind of a split between us because I think he saw that I was engaged, in trans with this young lady, and taking time away from our relationship of him and I, and it really kind of drove a wedge between us. And I graduated and I ended up going back to the farm for a while, and things just didn't seem to get any better. And I needed to make a decision whether um, Crystal and I were going to stay together for the long term, or I was going to basically choose my dad over my future wife. And so her and I decided we were going to go. Oh, to a neutral spot for a year, and then we went to a neutral spot for a year and made our decision. So we ended up moving to Eastern Kansas so I could be part of her family's farm. And that did not sit very well at all with my father, and so that really drove a wedge in between us for that. We were okay. We talked, and we got along, but there was definitely friction there. Then we got more involved with the farm, and there was just absolutely no way I was leaving this farm. And then he could see the writing on the wall, and that's really when it drove deep, that wedge in between us. And there was a spot where I didn't talk to my dad for 5, 6, 7 years, something like that, and I hadn't been talking to him in a while. And it was on my wife's birthday. Ironically, my aunt calls me at like 10:30 at night and says, "Hey, just so you know, your dad had a massive heart attack. He's getting life flighted from St. Francis to Denver. They don't know anything else." And I said, "Okay, well, keep me in the loop." So, go home, and I'm just like, what the heck do I do now? And then goes by, he's kind of getting better. They got a plan for him, but then turns out he didn't want any of this other stuff. He was kind of, okay with not doing any treatments or trying to get himself better. And so a week goes by, my aunt calls me and says, "Hey, they giving your dad, going to go ahead and take your dad. They don't know. He's taking a turn for the worse. He doesn't know if he's going to make it past tonight or not." And so I got an airplane ticket, hopped on a plane, flew to Denver, said my goodbyes to him. In 24 hours, I was home. Got a call 2 days later from my aunt saying that he is gone. Going through that, okay, he's gone. Our relationship wasn't that great. I said goodbye to him. I think I'm good. Start going through fall harvest, because he passed away in August, and so we get into fall harvest, long days, sitting in the combine, sitting in the tractor, sitting in the truck, and there's nothing else to do but think. And so, man, there's a lot to think about, a lot of digest. You just lost your dad. What the heck? He was a huge part of your life, even though you don't think he was. I started my attitude is really poor. I had some really bad anxiety. I wasn't sleeping very well at night. I was drinking way too much, probably. And my wife kind of nudged me, and I tell everybody this. She gave me a come to Jesus talk, and said, "You need to get help. You're kind of unbearable to deal with right now. You're not angry all the time. We're not getting along. You're not getting along with the kids. We need to figure this out." And my wife and I have a son that was diagnosed with ADHD, so he was seeing a therapist. So I made a connection with his therapist, and asked if there was somebody there that I could talk with. And so he got me in touch with her, and I was pretty apprehensive at first, because she was a city person that didn't know anything about ag and didn't know kind of my dynamics of what I was dealing with. And it still kind of bothered me a little bit that it was not an ag person per se, but I mean, she gave me so many different things to look at from an outsider coming into my world that I didn't see from my eyes, but she could see from hers, and it really helped me. And we met for 4 or 5 months, and she ended up taking another job, and she gave me so many tools to work with, and I was like, I got this. Everything's good. My life was better, sleeping better through the night. Everybody was getting along. Everything was good. Fast forward 4 or 5 years, pandemic looming. Start having more anxiety and problems, and we're getting more involved with taking over the family farm, with me, my brother-in-law, and my wife and his wife. And so the responsibilities and the burdens and, the financial contributions that we have to worry about on a daily basis. And I might, kind of go back into going down the rabbit hole every day. What if this, what if that? I can't do this because of, a breakdown or whatever. And so almost found myself having daily panic attacks. And so I got in touch with another friend of mine that works with a local organization here in town and got me in touch with some people and got some help. And the first conversation I had with my provider then was about some medication. And I said, not going to say no, but I don't really know anything about it. But, I've watched my son take medication for his ADHD, and it's a night and day difference for him. And so I had a friend of mine, pretty close friend of mine that I've made through some of my connections, that was kind of in the same situation I am, and he was on medication. So I reached out to him. I said, "What do you think?" And he's like, "I think it's a great thing. It's helped me tremendously. Just go in with an open mind. It doesn't have to be forever, but go in with an open mind. And if it's not right, we can change. They can change it. They have several things for you that they can work with." And so, with that confidence from my friend and from the prescriber, we went into it, and we had to adjust the dosage a couple different times to get me to where I felt comfortable on a daily basis of what I was doing, and in a good spot mentally and with my anxiety as well. And I'm still on the medication, and we're still doing it, and we're in good shape.
That must have been really, I don't know, intimidating or even scary to reach out for help. I know that's true for a lot of people, but I think especially with even just in my experience talking with people from more rural areas or from agricultural backgrounds, there's definitely an extra barrier there, like you were saying, with your therapist being more of a city person, not understanding that ag aspect of your life. Is that something that you felt while you were doing that?
Yeah, I did feel like that. I felt like I needed to. So we spent some of the session actually talking through some of the dynamics of the farm that she wouldn't have otherwise know, because she didn't have that sort of background, and she didn't understand the hours and the workload and stuff like that. So it was, as a farmer, we're taught to be teachers as well to the public, to help them understand where we're coming from on a daily basis. That way we're not the scary people too. So I was teaching as well as learning, and it was great, but at the same time it was frustrating because I was spending some of my session and some of my money basically teaching my therapist what I do on a daily basis. And it was frustrating, but at the same time it had to be done, I guess, to get to a better spot, and I was okay with that.
In your personal experience, what is a correlation between being a farmer and an ag worker and mental health?
Yeah, so there's just so many things that we have to deal with on a daily basis that are kind of out of our control, and I guess if you're not prepared for that situation, you can really get yourself into a lot of trouble. I used to worry about the littlest things that were way out of my control, like breakdowns, weather. If we were in the middle of harvest or something and a rainstorm would come through and we were out of the field for 2 or 3 days, there was like 2 or 3 days I didn't hardly sleep because I was just so worried. Why would this rain come at this time? Or a breakdown. It used to be pretty goal oriented, and I'd set myself up, I'm going to get X amount of acres done, but if I only got like a fraction of that, I was just beat myself up, and then I wouldn't sleep. And the beauty about taking this medication is it's helped me realize that a lot of that stuff was all in my head, and I just needed to let it go. And a lot of these things are out of our control, whether we believe it is or not. And if you only get 20 acres done in a day because you have a massive breakdown. Okay. I mean, yeah, the rain's coming, but you can't control stuff. You can do your best to keep maintenance up and do your best as a person to keep stuff organized. But at the same time, there's little stuff that it might get overlooked or it might just break on its own. It's just, you got to let stuff go sometimes, and you got to be okay with that.
I feel like the stakes are high too, because I feel that same sort of way where I gotten in the past struggled a lot with anxiety disorders and this fear of like not being in control of stuff. But with ag work and farming, it's like you're literally feeding people. Like people's lives literally depend on your work. So I can see like where that high anxiety would come from. That just sounds like a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. We were getting, I'll give you an example. A couple years ago, we were getting a brand new combine, and we were having this technology put on it, and I was in charge of all this technology, and it was freaking me out. And I sat with a therapist, and he printed me off a sheet, and he said, "Here, work through this worksheet with me." And I said, "Okay." I'm like, "What is this?" He's like, "We're going to debunk all your thoughts." And by the end of it, I was like, I guess it isn't that big of a deal, is it? And he's like, "No, it's not. It's all in your head." So I was like, so when you put stuff to pen to paper and you actually see it instead of just thinking it, it made a huge difference. So whenever I go to new places, or I've got people that are dealing with anxiety and stuff that they're worried about and thinking about constantly, I try to get them, I've saved this to my email, and I print them off a copy. I'm like, "Here, go work through this. Then here's the kind of the answer key for it on like your scores and stuff. And tell me what you feel after you do this." And they're like, "Holy cow, you're right. It's not that big of a deal." I'm like, "Yep, it's not." So just learning to let go of the little stuff is so huge. And the little stuff that we can't control is even bigger.
I think that is really impactful, just, letting go of the little stuff. I know personally I struggle with that too. I make a big deal out of nothing, realistically, because as you said, when you sit down and you break something down, you figure out like, oh, maybe I was overreacting over nothing really. And I can only imagine that stress when it comes to, as Isaac said, you have the responsibility of not only feeding your family and keeping a farm afloat, but then the responsibility of where all your work is going to. So that is, I think that fact that you're sharing at that worksheet is huge. You're able to help other people with that struggle, and that's really cool thing that you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. And it's just so eye opening. A lot of people that are, I've dealt with some committees that are there are some really high up professionals on this, and they're like, "I've never seen anything like this." And I'm like, "Well, take it. You can use it. Hand it out to your friends and that are dealing with something like this." And they're like, "Okay." So I mean, I just keep passing the tools out, and I feel like slowly making a difference.
Yeah, and that actually kind of ties into something it's and I were going to ask you about, which were the barriers that you've run into when accessing mental health care. So obviously, you're overcoming some barriers by even just passing out worksheets to people, making that accessible. And obviously, we
Right.
talked earlier too about therapists not knowing about ag work. But what are some other things you've run into along the way?
So growing up in Western Kansas, the whole mental health thing is a stigma and a taboo. And for anybody that grew up in a little town, everybody's business is everybody's business. So if there's a therapist in town and they see your pickup or your car in front of the therapist, even though you might not be there, you might be at the bank right next to it, or you might be at the donut shop on the other side of the street. But oh man, so and so's pickup was at in front of the therapy's office. What's going on there? And so, I mean, that's a huge thing. I mean, I've really opened up with a lot of my friends in Western Kansas about going and getting help, whether it be from a doctor or from a therapist or from their priest or preacher or somebody that's a close friend, just talking. has made a big difference in my life. And so getting over that stigma to ask for help is, I think, our biggest struggle in my industry for sure. Because we've been, my generation was taught by my grandparents went through the Depression, and it's we pick up ourselves by the bootstraps, and we dust ourselves off, and we just keep on trucking with our head down. We don't ask for help. We make do, and that's what we do. But the stresses of my generation of trying to take on these farms that with the massive amounts of cash flow that's going in and out on a almost a daily basis, it's very overwhelming at times. And if you don't have a good support system, it's huge. It can be a very big detriment if you don't have that support system.
Yeah, thank you. That's something definitely that I've noticed too in Southwest Kansas is number one, that stigma, but that idea of, well, if you don't talk about it, you don't want your neighbors to know. And as you said too, with that pickup truck analogy, that's the same thoughts here in town. If you don't want to be riding down the street and you're going to see John's truck at the therapist, because then that's going to give you
Yep.
something to talk about. And, and what you said, just actually having your support system and talking about it, I think help reduces that stigma and the power of telehealth and everything virtual. That's one of the, COVID was terrible, but that one of those few blessings was that a lot of therapists and a lot of, medical professionals started doing things virtually. And I feel like that really has helped our Western Kansas communities with mental health and physical health in general.
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing I can see from like the Western Kansas aspect is the lack of good internet out there. That can be a detriment, because I was out there for Thanksgiving seeing family, and I was driving around and I didn't have hardly any cell phone signal. I usually have pretty good cell signal here where I'm at in Eastern Kansas. So it's kind of I know I shouldn't be shocked, but at sometimes, I was trying to get a hold of family and talk, and while I was driving, and just didn't have any cell signal while I was driving. And that was frustrating. So is it a cure all? No, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. We just need to maybe access or have better access to internet and to sources to get help if people want to do telehealth, to keep the stigma to themselves for the time being.
So when it comes to that stigma question, do you have any experience with even helping people realize that mental health care is not anything to be ashamed of? Like, is talking with them about it actually effective, or what works?
Oh yeah. I've got up and talked in front of a whole room of farmers last February in Wisconsin, and when I left, there was like 3 or 4 of them just come running to me, and they're like, "I can't believe you just talked about that." I'm like, "Yeah," and they're like, "I'm struggling," and so it was so eye opening. And they're like, "Well, just seeing somebody your age being willing to talk about it," and I'm like, "It's okay, just it's who I am. So we went out in the hallway and had a conversation, and I find myself having more and more of those conversations the more talking I do with it to different groups, and or I'll get a random text or a random phone call from somebody that was a friend of a friend that heard my story, and so that's totally cool that we're breaking down barriers and getting over this stigma. Even if I'm not no licensed therapist, I'm just an ear to talk to. And a lot of times that's all a person needs, is somebody to talk to and listen. That's not their wife, not their father or their brother or their family at all. They just need an outsider ear just to listen. And my wife says I'm not very good at listening sometimes, but I'm usually in a tractor cab, so I can listen a long time. So I've had some really good conversations for hours just talking on the phone in the tractor, just going back and forth, nothing else to do. So that's when I do my best thinking, or get down that rabbit hole sometimes. But I try not to do that anymore.
In Nami, we have one of our sayings is that you're the expert of your own story. And I think that's a perfect example of that. You know, you're the expert in your own story, and then you're now taking that and you're helping teach other people in the ag and farming community and other people in general that it's nothing to be ashamed of. You can talk about your story. And as you said, you have the time to listen, and sometimes people, that's all they need is someone that's not their spouse, that's not their parent, that's in order to like just listen to them so they could vent.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's hard for me to farm with my wife's family because when I go home at night, if I have an issue with my wife's brother or my wife's dad, I can't go home and be like, "Did you know what your dad did today?" I don't go over very good at the dinner table. So, not only in front of my kids, but in front of her, so it's nice to have that small group of friends that know your story and know where you're coming from, and you can have that reliable um, confidence that they've got your back, and you can talk to them just like um, you would anybody, like you would your spouse almost. You just kind of unload on them, and they might have something good to come back at you with, or they might just sit there and be silent and just let you just go until you're done. And a lot of times when I get venting and I just get on my rampage and just keep going, and then when it's all out, it's just like, oh, okay, I'm good now. It just then the conversation turns into something way more low key and more upbeat, and it's just sometimes you just need that with I'll call it a third party outside source.
So, what resources do you usually recommend to people when they mention that they're struggling with mental health problems?
Um, I tell them to find somebody to talk to. If you can get out in front of it and talk to somebody, whether a lot of times these guys that I talk to, they're struggling by themselves. Yeah, their wives might see that they've changed a little bit, or their business partners see that they've changed a little bit, but maybe, well, he's working a lot of hours. Maybe he's stressed about that. Well, do you know? Did you go ask questions? So I tell these people that I'm dealing with, you got to talk for. I mean, you got to be the one. Be like, I'm not okay. Go, go tell somebody that you're not okay. Call me and tell me you're not okay. Um, just if you can get it out, I think the biggest thing for us as farmers is just asking for help, and getting over that stigma to ask and say, hey, I'm not okay. So I mean, just I tell people to have the brave, be brave and just ask for help. That's my first step. I tell everybody, just ask for help. Then I point people to, we have a local place here in town that's been really good for me, is Burt Nash. It's here in Lawrence. They do great things. And if that's not an option for them, I tell them to find, like what we were talking about with the telehealth, if that's an option for them, to find somebody that's a fit for them, or if they're involved in church in their community or something like that, tell them to maybe go have a conversation with their pastor if they have a good relationship with them. A lot of times those pastors have been in small towns for a long time, and or in a community that is, you might surprise you that he might know more about ag or your situation than what you might think he does. So, or her, and just just try to tell them to get help wherever they can is I guess my big selling point on that.
Yeah, it's with Nami, oftentimes we say you are not alone, and I think that's a perfect example of that. Knowing that you're not alone, that you could reach out to someone and ask for help, even if it's just talking to someone. And I think it's very big in our smaller communities, seeing if you could reach out to, if you are religious, to your church. I've noticed that's a huge thing in those more like those smaller communities. But if you do have the ability to seek help at, like as you said, at Burt Nash or virtually, I think that's also big. So that's it's awesome that you're able to tell everyone, just talk, just ask for help, because I feel like a lot of people haven't heard that. They grew up maybe believing like just don't talk about it. It's going to go away. And why would you
Yeah,
tell
for
someone?
sure.
So yeah. So being able to openly tell someone, just talk about it. And I think a lot of times that hits a person like, oh, I could actually do that. Like you care enough to listen to my problems. And for a lot of people, I think that's the first time they hear something like that. Like, it's okay. Like, just tell me about it.
Yeah, for sure. Just that's what I tell some of my friends that I've made out of this deal, because they've came to me and started talking, and I'm like, I'll just listen. You just keep going. And I've had some really good conversations, and I might chime in a little bit at the end or through it, and but at the same time, it's just like I'm there to listen. So I'm just somebody to vent to, and that I'm totally cool with that too. So just you got to find that trusted person, or um, or that stranger that's willing to listen to you. They're out there. They're totally out there. Just you never know who you're going to meet at Casey's or at Quick's Trip, getting a coffee or something, and strike up a conversation. You might become best friends. Who knows?
Thank you so much for coming on and talking with us, Lowell. I really appreciate it. I really like hearing your story, and I'm sure people are also going to really enjoy hearing your story.
Yeah, you bet. No problem. I'm glad to be a part of this, and my story's an open book. So if anybody ever has any thoughts or questions, feel free to get a hold of me.
How can we get a hold of you if someone would like to do that?
Yep. I'm on Instagram and I'm on Facebook. So just you can find me and send me a PM, and we'll get going from there. It's about the best we can do.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Wow, that was a really insightful conversation with Lowell. I think, I grew up in the Western Kansas area, and I know farmers and ag workers, but I really didn't know that much of how they truly struggle with their mental health. And I'm so glad there is someone like Lowell who knows about these communities, and he's doing his best to help everyone else. As he offered to talk to people in his PMs, he makes presentations, he's out here handing out resource sheets, and that's truly what we want to see in our rural and struggling communities.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been saying in the trailer and in our last episode, nothing about us without us, right? That's what Dr. Vaughn loves to say, nothing about us without us. And Lowell is doing his very best job in improving that. You can't talk about the mental health care of farmers, of ag workers, of rural and frontier Kansans without talking to them and asking them what they need and including them in that conversation. So just as Lowell is promoting resources for farmers, I'm also going to plug in Nami Kansas resource line. That's my job. If you're in need of resources, go to namikansas.org. So that's spelled all the way out, namikansas.org. We have a searchable resource table where you can find resources for certain issues or in your area. You can also contact us and ask us for help either via email or phone call. Just visit our website and check us out if you're in need of any resources. So thank you again, Itzel, for joining us today. Thank you again to Lowell for joining us today. Remember, nothing about us without us. And I am Nami Kansas.
And I am Nami Kansas too.